Good evening. Can I give you a 2-minute warning to try and find your way back to the nave, and if you desperately need the toilet, now is the time to dash. So we'll be starting in 2 or 3 minutes' time. Thank you. Well, good evening. Good evening and welcome to York Minster on behalf of the Dean and Chapter and York Minster Fund. My name is Neil Sanderson and I'm Director of York Minster Fund, which means that if you have any spare change in your pocket, you don't want to talk to me. My only role tonight is to welcome you and to thank you for joining us, whether in person or through our live stream, and to do a few housekeeping points. Please do check that your phones are at least in the silent mode. There's nothing worse than the stare from your neighbour as your phone goes off. And remember that, unfortunately, we have to continue wearing masks while not speaking. We're not expecting a fire, even though this place has a history of that. But if we do need to evacuate, there will be an announcement made from the lectern and the stewards will direct you where to go. I'm delighted this evening to be welcoming Nicholas Thistlethwaite to speak on the history of the organ, and he will shortly join us for a talk, and then Robert Sharp and Ben will do a demonstration of the restoration that has just taken place. If you have any burning questions at the end of that, we'll be doing a question and answer session. And as long as they're easy questions, I will give them to them. If they're too difficult, then you'll have to send them in triplicate. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Nicholas, who will speak on the history of York Minster's organs from 1236 to 2021. Nicholas.
It's a great pleasure to be with you this evening. I travelled up this morning from East Anglia and was a little concerned when the train was held up at Peterborough. However, it turned out that the reason was that the Flying Scotsman was about to pass through, which was a real bonus. To see and hear both the Flying Scotsman and the reconstructed organ in York Minster on the same day is almost too much bliss. I'd like to thank the York Minster Fund for the opportunity to speak about the history of the Minster organ. But it presents me with something of a dilemma. Most of you here this evening, and those with us online, have already, and perhaps rashly, purchased a copy of the book. So I've been searching, scratching my head and wondering what I can say that will not take the edge off the pleasure, and I sincerely hope it will be a pleasure, of reading the book for yourselves. What I propose to do, therefore, is to talk about the various organs in their relationship with the remarkable building in which you are seated. This will give me a chance to say something about the ways in which organs have migrated around the Minster over the years and why that was. It will also allow me to talk about their visual appearance. For organs, as well as being musical instruments, also contribute visually to their architectural setting. And then, as Neil has just said, there will be an opportunity for questions towards the end of this session. Entering the Minster from the west end of the nave, the visitor's eye is immediately led to the massive structure of wood, pipes and paint that today sits on top of the choir screen or pulpitum. It is, of course, the case designed by Robert Smirke for the new pioneering organ built by the firm of Elliott and Hill following the catastrophic Minster fire of 1829, in which its predecessor perished. Nicholas Pevsner, in the York volume of his Buildings of England series, is fairly neutral about it. Organ case, it says, designed by Sir Robert Smirke, 1832, originally with an ungainly crownwork in the centre, later removed. Good diaper decoration on the display pipes. To the casual visitor unaccompanied by Pevsner, the organ in its Gothic case probably looks as though it has been there forever. But, of course, not only has this particular organ only been in place since 1832, some of its predecessors were located elsewhere in the building. Many of the earliest organs would have had no permanent location at all. Medieval stained glass, illuminated manuscripts, and painted altarpieces frequently include figures of angels playing small organs suspended by straps around the player's neck, like the modern accordion. Typically, they have 12 or 18 pipes and a short keyboard, which the angelic organist plays with the right hand, whilst operating a small bellows with the left. It wasn't only angels that played these instruments. They'd be used in outdoor processions, but also inside the Minster during peripatetic liturgies, sounding the plainsong intonations, or just possibly playing with other portable instruments. Appropriately enough, they're called portative organs. Rather larger were positive organs. These stood on the floor of the church and were usually small enough to be moved by a couple of stout vergers to wherever they were needed. Musically, they were considerably more resourceful than the portative organs. The keyboard would typically have at least 2 octaves of notes, and there might be 2 or 3 ranks of pipes, or stops, as they were coming to be known. As well as the player, who now had to deploy both hands to sound the notes of the keyboard, they required someone to operate the bellows. We are fortunate that 2 sculptures of positive organs have survived on the west front of the choir screen behind me, and they are illustrated in the book. You can see the player at the keyboard and the assistant operating the wedge-shaped bellows on either side of the instrument. The pipes are mounted on a simple wind chest. When the player presses a key, a valve known as a pallet admits wind to the pipe, causing it to sound. Organs like these were common in great churches, accompanying singers antiphonally in the choir stalls or standing beside the altar in a side chapel. In 1399, an unnamed organ player at York was paid 7 shillings and 4pence for, I quote, playing the organs before the cross and in other places in the church. Now, the plural organs doesn't necessarily imply more than one instrument. The terminology, a pair of organs, was used to describe a single instrument, just as we speak of a pair of scissors or a pair of trousers. So we don't actually know whether the reference is to one organ that was moved around the minster or to a number of organs in different locations. As the technology became more sophisticated in the 14th century, the organs themselves became larger and consequently more permanent. Small organs continued to be useful because they could be moved around, but instruments with more sets of pipes and greater numbers of keys began to appear and were often housed in handsome wooden and painted cases and placed in prominent locations. It may be no coincidence that this development coincided with the construction of substantial stone screens, or pulpitums, which separated the nave and transepts from the liturgical choir. As well as marking a significant boundary, they provided a raised platform or loft for liturgical actions, such as the reading of the gospel. There is evidence, too, that singers were sometimes stationed in this loft, and it's therefore not surprising that by the 15th century, we begin to find occasional references to organs being located there as well. We know, for example, that both Canterbury and Durham had the largest and most technologically advanced of their several organs located in the pulpitum by the early years of the 16th century. Here at York, evidence is more elusive, but it may be significant that the fabric accounts record a part payment for a new organ in 1432-3. Architectural historians tell us that this was probably about the time that the new stone pulpitum was completed. It's known that the vicars' chorals sang from the earlier pulpitum on festal occasions, and it's therefore reasonable to conjecture that this custom continued, and that as the music became more elaborate with the development of polyphony, an organ located in close proximity to the singers became an essential component of the liturgy. By the early 16th century, on the eve of the Reformation, it's probable that the minster would have been equipped with a number of instruments. The principal or great organ on the pulpitum, a positive or small organ with 3 or 4 stops on the floor of the choir near the singers, an instrument in the Lady Chapel, and probably other smaller organs that served where needed. For the next century or so, information about the fate of the minster's organs is sparse. Archbishop Robert Holgate, appointed in 1544, and not by the sound of it a bundle of laughs, was a convinced Protestant whose reforms included an attempt to curtail drastically the role of music in worship. In 1552, he directed, and I quote, that there be no more playing of the organs, either at the morning prayer, the communion, or the evening prayer within the Church of York, but that the said playing do utterly cease. Following the brief reinstatement of Catholic liturgy under Mary Tudor, and then the accession of Elizabeth in 1558, a less radical position was adopted. Organists, choristers, vicars choral, and lay vicars continued to be appointed. And gradually, a repertoire of vernacular anthems and canticle settings was developed for use with the new Book of Common Prayer. We can only guess what happened to the organs during these years, But it's probable that, as at other cathedrals, where, unlike York, contemporary records have survived, a rationalization took place. Existing materials were most likely used to construct a single instrument for the choir, after which any unwanted, smaller organs would have been sold for scrap. By the 1630s, the Elizabethan organ must have been showing its age. Liturgical change was also afoot. Nationally, the movement known as Arminianism or Laudianism was gathering strength. Led by William Laud, the Bishop of London, and Richard Neile, Bishop of Durham, its supporters sought a recovery of what they termed the beauty of holiness through the reinstatement of ceremony and the enhancement of the role of music in worship. When Neile was translated to the Archbishopric of York in 1632, even conservative Protestant York was unable to resist the swelling tide, not least because it had the wholehearted support of the king. In the same year that Neile became Archbishop, 1632, the dean and chapter were granted £1,000 by the king for purposes which included the setting up of a new organ. In the following year, Charles I actually paid a personal visit to the minster. He took an interest in the location of the new organ, directing that it should be placed, and I quote from a later source, not as it formerly had been, upon the organ screen, but against the north side of the choir, opposite the Archbishop's throne. His Majesty giving for reason that, if placed upon the organ screen at the entrance of the choir, it would spoil the prospect of the fine east window from the nave. Well, it was not unusual at this period for cathedral organs to be placed in galleries on one side of the choir, where they would be in close proximity to the singers. Lincoln, St. Paul's, and Canterbury were examples. But it's particularly interesting that the king's reason for ordering the removal of the organ from the pulpitum was a matter of architectural aesthetics rather than musical practicality. Like the early Gothic revivalists of the following century, Charles wished to expose the interior vista of the minster from west to east, culminating in the great east window. The king got his way, as kings tended to. Robert Dallam, the leading London organ maker of the day, who was much patronised by Laudian deans and bishops, Oxbridge colleges, and the king himself, built a new organ with 2 keyboards, costing £307. The total cost of the loft and the 2 organ cases was almost as much, £302, 7 shillings and 9 pence. Detailed accounts survive, recording the payments to carvers, carpenters, joiners and painters. 2 carvers, for example, were paid for 52 weeks' work. Mr. Babb, the painter, was a member of the Worshipful Company of Painter-Stainers in the City of London. His work, costing no less than £100, was crucial for ensuring that the new organ would impress the eye as well as the ear. His embellishment of the wooden cases with gilding and colours, and probably also with marbling and heraldic devices, was an unapologetic assertion of the importance of instrumental and choral music in cathedral worship. As such, it undoubtedly gave deep offence to the Puritans, and no doubt stoked religious division in York. Sadly, we have no pictures of the Dallam organ, which was completed in 1634. It used to be thought that the cases or parts of them survived the interregnum to be reused in 1660, and that the organ destroyed in the conflagration of 1829 gave us an impression of the appearance of Dalham's organ. We now know that that was incorrect, as I will explain why shortly. Most church organs were, of course, destroyed on the orders of Parliament during the Civil War. However, a handful of Dalham cases have survived in whole or in part, including some in Brittany, to which the family emigrated during the Cromwellian regime. And this, plus the documentation, enables us to form some impression of what the York cases would have looked like. There were two cases: a larger main case for what was called the great organ, the main division if you like, and a smaller chair or choir organ case behind the organist's back. The two keyboards would probably have been disposed one above the other, with the draw stops to either side. Both cases would have been richly carved and painted in the manner of style. Some of the display pipes would have been embossed, and they would all have been gilded or coloured. We begin to see why the eminent Mr. Babb was summoned from London with his paint pots, and why the cases were so costly. This sort of polychromatic scheme is not unlike some of the highly coloured funerary monuments of the Jacobean and Caroline periods, and similar decorative schemes were applied to the interiors of theatres and public halls. The reconstructed Globe Theatre in London is an example. So one way and another, the Dalham organ firmly aligned the Minster with the Laudian movement, which was speedily taking control of the leadership of the established church at this time. But, as we know, this triumph was short-lived. In 1644, York was occupied by the Parliamentarian army, and the following year the Commonwealth Committee for York ordered the organ pipes to be handed over to their agent. Then, in 1646, two trustworthy aldermen were directed to arrange for the demolition of what they called the Great Organ Loft in the Minster, laying aside the waste timber, as it was termed, for public use. Although the organ cases are not mentioned specifically, they must have been removed and almost certainly broken up by this stage. Charles II was restored to his kingdom in May 1660, and by August of that year it was reported at York that, I quote, "the singing men and organs are preparing." Choral services were resumed, and what was probably a temporary organ was installed. In 1661, a new gallery was erected in the former position on the north side of the choir, and an organ builder by the name of Preston installed a two-manual organ there. By the mid-1680s, it was already in poor condition, and Archbishop Dolben ordered that, I quote, "the great organ be with all convenient speed repaired and made fit for service." Now, for some reason, possibly because the 1661 organ now appeared old-fashioned, it was decided not to attempt to repair it, but instead to replace it with a new instrument. Thomas Comber, the precentor, took the lead and with difficulty raised the necessary funds, including £200 from Archbishop Lamplugh, who also made a commitment to pay for a new organ case. Inconveniently, we might think, Lamplugh died in 1691, just 4 months after the contract had been made with Bernard Smith, the King's organ maker, for a new 3-manual instrument in the modern style. Comber managed to persuade Lamplugh's executor to honour the Archbishop's undertakings, but by this time a debate had obviously begun about the location of the new organ. Some, it seems, favoured the existing gallery in the choir, while others were pressing for a return to the pulpitum. Smith, meanwhile, down in London in his workshop, was told to get on with making the organ on the dubious assumption that it would be suitable for either location. In the event, the pulpitum party prevailed, and Smith had installed the organ there by the spring of 1692. At long last, we have engravings, drawings, and paintings which reveal the appearance of a York Minster organ, and many of these appear in my book. One of the earliest of these was in Drake's Eboracum, published in 1736. This included an interior view of the minster from the west end, with the organ in the middle distance on the pulpitum. Its most prominent feature is a central spire or flesh on top of the case, which points heavenwards towards the apex of the massive tower arch above it. Presumably, this was intended to lend elegance to the case, but the effect was rather spoilt by the fact that the organ was centered on the middle arch of the pulpitum and not the apex of the tower arch. As you can see from where you're sitting, if you haven't already noticed this, the pulpitum is not symmetrical. There are 7 niches for the king's statues on the north side and 8 on the south. And so the flesh was not directly below the apex of the tower arch, but very obviously to the north of it. Other images survive showing the east front of the organ from the choir. A painting of 1827 by John Harwood records swags supporting the heraldic devices of Archbishop Lampew and the Earl of Strafford, another benefactor. There is intricate tabernacle work on top of the towers and graceful receding perspectives implied by the arrangement of the pipes in the flats. By the 1820s, when this painting was made, the cases seem to have been stained in brown. But in 1692, it's likely that colours and gilding would have been applied, if not quite as exuberantly as on the Dalham case of 1634. However, after 1692, the organ was back on the pulpitum. But there was to be a final controversy over its location in 1829, when the fire-raising activities of poor Jonathan Martin led to the destruction of the instrument originally installed by Smith, which had subsequently been enlarged and altered by others, most recently and most extensively in 1803. The fire cleared the way for radical thoughts about how to accommodate its successor, the innovative and considerably larger instrument conceived by Dr. John Camage, who was assistant to his father Matthew, the Minster organist. Before this, John Camage had already made his mark on the building. He had a vision. This was the early 19th century. The Gothic revival was underway. The Romantic movement, with its quest for sensation and extremes of expression and volume, was burgeoning. Camage was frustrated by the failure of the Minster organ, with its rather polite, gracious voice, to make much impression on the vast spaces of the Minster. Should have been here this evening. He and his friend Jonathan Gray, a York attorney, yearned for an organ that would, as Gray put it, fill that spacious edifice with a volume of sound. Working initially with a local York organ builder, John Ward, Camage set about redesigning the old organ to achieve his objective. In 1815, he had Ward raise the wind pressures and undertake extensive revoicing of the pipework. The results were encouraging, but hardly sensational. So Camage resolved on a more radical plan. He knew that one of the features of the famous continental organs in places like Hamburg and Haarlem was their large pedal divisions. These were virtually unknown in England at this time, although a few enterprising builders had begun to include a short compass pedal board and even a few pedal pipes by the early 1800s. Camage, in his quest for power and volume, decided that the answer was to add a German-style pedal organ with no fewer than 13 stops to the York organ. But his problem was where to accommodate them. There was no space inside the organ case for these large pipes, some of which were 24 feet long. Cammage decided that the only solution was to hollow out the pulpitum and house the pedal organ in chambers on either side of the central arch. It sounds extraordinary to us in the 21st century, but Cammage was allowed to gut the interior of the medieval pulpitum, demolishing the stone staircases on either side, removing internal divisions, and installing Ward's new pedal pipes in their place. The mechanical connections to the organ console must have been tortuous. But the loyal York newspapers reported that the instrument, as rebuilt by Cammage and Ward, combined, I quote, "the depth and power of the continental organs with the sweetness and mellowness of the English." They also reported, and again I quote, "a gentleman of considerable musical talent and celebrity had inspected the York organ and found it superior to all the principal organs of Germany and Holland." Some claim. Well, we shall never know. This was the organ that went up in flames on the 1st of February, 1829. 1 month later, Cammage hastened up to London to seek quotations for a new instrument of unprecedented size to fulfill his ambition of filling the Minster with a volume of sound. The organ builders, Elliott and Hill, provided a quotation of £2,200. The contract was signed on the 24th of April, less than 2 months after the fire. What followed is a very long story indeed. We haven't time to go into it now, but it's all in the book. Let me end, though, by describing the final skirmish over the organ's location. Complaints about the obstruction of the vista caused by the organ had rumbled on over the years, becoming more vociferous as enthusiasm for medieval buildings and Gothic architecture increased. By August 1829, Robert Smirke, the architect retained to rebuild the east end of the Minster, had come forward with a definite plan to remove the organ from the screen and reconfigure it by dividing it on either side of the choir, though leaving some pipes, presumably the pedal pipes, in the pulpitum chambers. None of these pipes were to rise more than 12 or 18 inches above the west front of the screen. How Elliott and Hill were expected to contrive the key and pedal mechanisms of the instrument and where on earth the console was to go were mere details that were not explained. Nonetheless, the organ builders took a deep breath, we may imagine, and accepted the brief and began work on the building frames of the various divisions. But then a further complication arose. Dean Coburn, a man who knew his mind and didn't suffer fools gladly, decided he wanted to take the opportunity to expose the bases of the tower arch, the one under which the pulpitum stood. He therefore wanted to move the pulpitum, or at least its west front, eastwards to reveal the arch and its bases. A contemporary engraving survives, which not only shows how the pulpitum would be moved eastwards, but includes a glimpse of the divided organ case on the north side of the choir. A pamphlet war ensued during 1830, which was not resolved until February 1831, when the Dean reluctantly accepted defeat following a meeting of subscribers to the Restoration Fund, at which a vote was forced. But it was not until the end of June 1831 that the decision to divide the organ was rescinded, and it was confirmed that it would, after all, be placed back on the pulpitum, like its predecessor. This must have been a huge relief to Cammage and the organ builders. On the one hand, it gave Camage freedom, or so he thought, to accommodate the instrument of unprecedented size for which he longed, and it absolved Elliott and Hill from the challenge, which was almost certainly insoluble for the technology of that period, of designing a workable mechanism to operate an organ divided on either side of the choir with other pipes in the pulpitum. The case that Smirke designed for this monster organ, and which survives to this day, was probably about 4 times the size of the one lost in the fire. It was tall enough to accommodate some of the 16-foot manual basses specified by Camage, and deep enough to house the 2 great soundboards, which between them held 24 stops, each with a compass of 73 notes, 6 octaves in all, 10 of them commencing with pipes of 16-foot pitch. There were 3,066 pipes in Smirke's case, compared with just 1,087 in the old organ before Camage's alterations. Many of Elliott and Hill's 250 pedal pipes were housed within the pulpitum, but the bottom octaves of the lowest registers, though those of 32-foot pitch, had to be placed in the 2 choir aisles to gain sufficient height. Some of them are still there today. Even so, Smirke's case wasn't quite large enough for Camage's ambitions, and the large swell box projected out of the top. The solution was to conceal it with Gothic tabernacle work, the crown work mentioned by Pevsner, which survived until 1903, when Walker rebuilt the organ, and a way was found of lowering the swell. But you can see the original crownwork in an illustration in the book. So the organ finally came to rest on the pulpitum, and there it has remained since 1832. Embellished with Mr. Blackmore's colourful pipe decorations in 1859, it has surely established itself over the years as an essential feature of the Minster's interior. And it is somehow appropriate that beneath this massive and splendid case, we can still see sculptures of medieval positive organs, which remind us of how the story began. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas, for that fascinating run through the history of organs and where they've been. One of the early discussions in our recent restoration was about where we were going to move some of the pipes. So the problems of the past are still the problems of today. Although, had we had a budget of £2,200, I would have been considerably more pleased. The quote I was particularly affected by was filling this gracious edifice with a volume of sound. For those who were at Evensong, you would have heard how the new organ does fill this edifice. But now we're going to pass over to Robert and Ben Morris, our organist, who will show us how the restoration has added to that volume of sound. Robert.
Good evening, everyone. Can I also extend my personal welcome to you all, and in particular to 2 of our organists emeritus who are with us tonight, Philip Moore and John Scott Whiteley. I think we're unique at the moment in having 3 organists emeritus, and the third one, Francis Jackson, was able to visit us on Monday and hear the organ. And this is surely unique because he first heard the organ in 1928 and is later this year to be 104 years old. And he sends his best greetings to you all and said he would have loved to have been here tonight, but it was just a little bit too much for him. And I'm sure you'll know that Nicholas's book is dedicated to our wonderful doyen of English cathedral organists, Francis Jackson. Ben Morris, our very gifted Assistant Director of Music, is seated at the console now, and I thought as part of this point in the evening, it would be good to demonstrate some of the capabilities of the organ, just to give you a little bit of an idea of what's the same and what's different. It might be worth talking first about the layout. As you look at the organ case from your place there, the swell box since 1903 fills the north side of the case, so it's basically half of the case, this side. And then the great division is on the other side, on the south side. And those have remained in that layout as they always have been since 1903. And that was the way that Walker was able to bring the swell box down into the case so that it wasn't sticking out over the top. The choir organ is bracketed out over into the east of the church, over the top of the console, the screen console. And then we've made a little change to the solo division, which was in the north chamber of the screen, and you could just see the top of the solo box from the nave if you were to look on this side. And the solo has come inside the case, but at the floor level, so it's effectively slid across into the center. And its shutters now form the north end of the case at the lower impost level. So they speak out into the church, whereas before they spoke into the organ with some additional ones in the roof. So that's been a change which has allowed us to take down the curtains which hid the lower part of the case on the east side, and has given a more imposing view of the organ because it now has its waist before it rises up, which looks rather splendid. In the choir aisles on each side, you can see the 32-foot pipes which Nicholas referred to, which date back to the 1830s. And then we've returned the Walker 1903 pedal open diapason and the wooden 32-foot reed with its 16-foot extension back to the position as they occupied originally in 1903. So the open diapason is now back across in front of the open metal, and the reed is back down in the north aisle. If any of you have been to see those, the oak panelling is not yet complete around those, so they won't look eventually like they do now, which is a little bit, you can see all the steel supports, that's going to be panelled in, but because of furloughing and rescheduling of works departments and things, because that's all our internal work, that work is yet to take place. So we're going to start with the swell division. Mr. Arthur, as in Arthur Harrison, always began the tonal finishing of the organ with the swell. That's not my main reason for going there, though, first. It's because, as part of this work, the swell, which has its shutter front on the south of the box, so facing that way, that enables this rather diffused York full swell sound to come into the building on both sides, very effective with it when accompanying a choir. But we've added on the west end of the swell box an additional shutter front, which can be engaged with a draw stop. And the pipes inside the box have been reconfigured so that the basses are at the east end of the box and the trebles on a CC sharp soundboard at this end of the box. So when the shutters are open, the sound of the swell is able to project down into the nave across this central tower space without losing any impact. But when it's heard from the east of the case, it's exactly as it was before. So Ben's going to just give us just a single 8-foot flute on the swell, the raw flute, and demonstrate this single stop without the west shutters, and then a similar thing with the shutters on. So you can hear with just one stop how the instrument transverses into the nave now. And then we'll just go a little bit louder with that same division, the same demonstration with the 8- and 4-foot diapasons on the swell, please. And then we're going to hear now the swell chorus, so up to the 2 mixture stops. Firstly, without the west shutters, so as they would have sounded before, and then with the shutters engaged. And then finally, just to give you the full effect, the full swell, one of York's most famous sounds. So heard first with the original shutter front and then with the west ones under, and maybe with a bit of pedal as well. In addition to that shutter front, the recent work has also seen the majority of the case pipes brought back into use. Walker decided not to do this in 1903 when he turned the inside of the organ round and put the console on the side of the organ, leaving the case pipes all as dummies, or as dumb pipes maybe. They still were able to speak but weren't connected up. So inside the organ, there were alternative zinc bases of up to 16-foot and large 8-foot bases, which served the stops which originally had their bases in the front. So these have the effect of hemming in the instrument to some extent, especially the Great Division. And so by bringing the case pipes into play again, some of which, the biggest ones, are new, decorated to match, and some of which are original, those internal zinc bases have been taken away, which has enabled the sound to transverse the tower more freely. Before we get to the Great, we're going to hear some of the softer solo stops now. All lovers of the organ love to hear the solo division of a cathedral instrument. Ben will just demonstrate the different solo reeds on the solo division. And this will include the new clarinet stop, which replaces an altered rank, which was changed several times in the history of the organ. So we decided to have a brand new clarinet in the Harrison style. It's also possible to use now the swell division as another solo organ because of the versatility of the west shutters. So just a very quick demonstration here of the violin diapason on the swell with the tremulant as a solo stop played against the great stop diapason, which is a very beguiling sound in the room. We're going to move now to the great division of the organ, the principal division. This is actually 2 stops smaller now than it was before the rebuild, but some of the things within that division are bigger. The great originally had 4 open diapasons from 1903 through to 1960, when the largest one was, in the fashion of the day, taken away from the great and placed in the pedal organ. So Ben will just demonstrate now the 8-foot stops of the grate, starting with the flutes, and then maybe if we could go, Ben, to the solitional and then through the different diapasons, and finally adding the 8-foot number 1 open diapason, which you'll hear brings the sound very much into this space here. It's designed really in this scheme to be a nave stop. So you have to remember with this organ there are different ways of playing it for when people are out here than there are when they're up there. And only on one occasion in the year, Christmas Eve at 4 o'clock, do we have people in both spaces. So it's possible to use the organ in 2 guises. So here are the great foundation stops. And from that foundation, we can now hear the great, very briefly, if we could, I'm just building up through the whole of the flue work, Ben. And then some of the louder reeds on the organ, we'll hear, first of all, the great per sounds. These are the normal great reeds, which were originally a 16-foot and 8-foot pair, and they've been joined by a new clarion to form the full great without the big reeds, which are treated as a special effect. So maybe if we can hear the 8 and then the 16 and then the 4 added and on the great reeds. And then in the swell, we have a similar set of reeds, 16 2/8 and a 4. So if we can hear just the contrast between those, the 4 swell reeds all together, Ben, and the great reeds that you've just done all together. And they've become a much more equal partnership because of the shutter front, which helps to bring the swell into the nave. On the solo, there were 2 what are known in York as the little tubers, to distinguish them from our famous big tuba. So the 16-foot tuba is in fact an open shallot stop and quite a bright sound, almost like an orchestral trumpet. So here's a few notes on that first. Then the 8-foot tuba in contrast. And then now on the great we have a tromba 8, which can be used both as a solo tuba for small effects, especially in the choir, or it can be added to the full organ when you need to support a very big congregation. So here's the 8-foot tromba. And then with the 4-foot added to that. And that naturally leads now to the tuba mirabilis, perhaps in single notes, and then maybe the odd chord, which before it was a different world from the rest of the organ, but now is led up to by those reeds that you've just heard. So here's the famous tuba mirabilis. And then just to finish with, I'm going to ask Ben, just before he does a quick build-up through the full organ, for those of you who didn't hear it at Evensong, just to give us a few chords on the echo dulciana. Now, this is the quietest sound on the organ, and Dr. Jackson described it as being able to make a congregation listen intently at a pianissimo climax. You don't think of climaxes being pianissimo, but rather fortissimo. But in fact, if something is so quiet, it feels climactic because of the softness, then it can be described in that way. So here's the echo dulciana, firstly with the solo box open, and you'll have to listen really carefully, and then with it closed, and when it goes down to nothing. And unbelievably, for those of you who know about things like wind pressure, that is voiced on 8 inches of wind, which is a completely ridiculous thing because the rest of the solo is on that. And the way that achieves that softness with that extraordinary pressure is by having footholes which are literally the size of a pencil lead. So very little of that 8 inches is actually admitted into the pipe. So we're just going to do a quick build-up now, starting midway up the grate with some swell and then building up to the full organ to round off this demonstration before we have the questions. And my thanks to Ben for those wonderful improvisations to demonstrate the effects of the organ. Can we give him a round of applause?
So now we have the opportunity for a few minutes of questions. We are running a little bit late, but we wanted to give people a chance to ask any questions they have. So I have an assistant who will be, if you'd like to ask a question, would you raise your hand and she will come across and use a microphone to find you. So do we have any questions from the floor? We have one at the front here.
One of the most characteristic features of a vintage Harrison organ is the harmonics mixture on the great organ. And I would very much like to hear the chorus, the great chorus, with and without, or without and then with, the new harmonics mixture, please, if that's possible.
Very possible. Ben, are you still at the organ? Yes, so if you could just do the number 1 up to 2 foot and then add the 3-up mixture and then the harmonics and then the other way round, and then the 5 rank on top of the harmonics as well. This is a distinctive sound which we've reinstated on the organ, which contains both the 17th and also the flat 21st. And it adds great panache to the instrument in a big acoustic like this, particularly when accompanying hymns and playing romantic repertoire. That give you enough of an impression of it? Thank you.
I've got one question that was from one of our online watchers, and it's about the historic wind pressure and how the historic organs created wind pressure. I don't know whether, Nicholas, you could comment on that.
Yes. One of the factors that limited the development of the organ was indeed the difficulty of raising both a sufficient quantity and an adequate pressure of wind. I cannot remember how many bellows this organ had, say, in the middle of the 19th century, and how many people were required to pump them. Not even sure we've got that information. But whatever bellows were blown manually, a large organ, particularly the large organ that Dr. Camage attempted to build, required a lot of manpower. I think I'm allowed to say that because it always was manpower in those days. And it was really only when mechanical means of operating the bellows began to develop in the 1850s and 60s that it became possible to go for these higher wind pressures, and so ultimately to think of providing enough wind for something like a tuba mirabilis. But before that, it was a real constraint on developing a large enough sound. It was difficult to produce wind of a sufficient pressure, not easy to raise more than about 3.5 inches of wind pressure. Whereas your tuba mirabilis is on
25 inches.
25 inches. So it's a big difference.
Do we have any more questions from the floor?
Sorry, a very organ-y question. You have a brand new 32-foot reed. I was just wondering what the thinking was behind adding, besides joining the elite club of having organs with 2 32-foot reeds, what the reasoning was for doing that, and also, can we actually hear, very indulgently, the difference between the 2 32-foot reeds perhaps on their own?
Of course. It was remiss of me not to include that as part of the demonstration. The Arthur Harrison, when the ophicleide stop was added to the pedals in 1931, is known to have lamented the fact that it wasn't possible to carry the rank down a further octave to 32-foot pitch. There wasn't actually anywhere to put it if that had been possible financially. But in fact, this didn't form part of the original scheme for the restoration of this organ a few years ago when we were first finalising things. But a group of individuals, led by one in particular, suggested that it would be a missed opportunity not to complete the ophicleide in the way that Arthur Harrison had wished, given the fact that mechanically the organ was going to be new, and the fact that some case pipes were going to be back in use, which would make space within the screen for it. So the ophicleide 32 was added as an addition to the contract at a later date. And what it does is to provide an enormous underpinning to the tutti that you've just heard, whereas the wooden trombone, which for a period of time was called sackbut, is a more foundational sound. So maybe, Ben, if we could hear the trombone 16 and then 32 just in the bottom octave together, and then if you could do then the ophicleide on its own in the bottom octave and then add the 32-foot ophicleide so we can compare the two. And the wooden trombone is on 8 inches pressure, and the ophicleide, which goes right up to 4 foot, so it's a very, very bold sound, is on 25 like the tuba mirabilis. When Dr. Jackson heard that on Monday, he declared that Sir Edward would have approved and asked me to use it at the end of one of Bertheux's pieces, which we played as part of his visit. So it's a luxury, and in fact, you rightly say that we're a member of the elite club of cathedral organs with 2 32-foot reeds. We also have 2 open 32-foot flues, and a number of cathedral organs with 4 open 32-foot. It's very, very small indeed. Not that anyone's counting.
Having scared all the animals in Dean's Park with the 32-foots, have we got any more questions from anybody? We have one just down here.
Do the organists prefer the nave console or the one in the loft?
That's a good question. The question was, do we prefer the nave console or the one upstairs? I think our view has changed a little bit on that with this recent work, because when you sit playing the organ upstairs, you are underneath the choir organ, and there's a lot of wood around you, so you hear the organ at one remove. What you can hear very well from that position is the choir singing behind you downstairs. And we're not doing services in there apart from matins on Sunday at the moment, so we haven't had a chance to do that very much. But when you play the organ from the nave console downstairs now, especially because of the new West Well shutters, it's a very, very exciting experience. Where it is at the moment in the crossing there, the organist is very much in the firing line of the sound, and so it's an exciting experience playing from there. I think when we get used to playing upstairs regularly again, we'll enjoy the immediacy of that console. But certainly the rewards at the nave console now are greater than they were because of the increased projection of sound.
Robert, I wonder if we could hear a little bit of the choir organ. I know it speaks into the choir, but it has such wonderful sounds. And I was struck the other day how well it sounds in the nave. So just a few little tidbits from that side of the organ.
This is a question from Philip Moore, my predecessor, who was asked to hear the choir division, which, as I've said, is on the other side of the organ. Because there are fewer internal bass pipes now, the sound of the choir does come through to the nave quite well, although it's very much an echo division compared with what you have heard and speaks more directly into the choir. But maybe, Ben, we could just hear the 8-foot flute and then the 8 and 4 and then some of the other things very, very quickly.
I think we probably have time for one more question if anybody else has a question. If not, then I would like to thank very much Robert and Nicholas, and especially Ben. I feel we should get Ben to come up onto the platform if he can prise himself out of the console. He doesn't look very keen. He's coming. Here he comes. So thank you very much to all our speakers. Thank you very much for coming. For those of you who've bought the book, thank you very, very much. You're contributing towards our ongoing music and organ work. As they say, you can see us here every day, and the organ is played most days for evensong when we're doing evensong. So please do encourage people to come and listen to what is now a magnificent instrument and to join in with the worship and our choristers. And thank you very much to Nicholas, who has recorded the history and the restoration so well. And it's been a pleasure. This is the first time I've physically met Nicholas as part of this project, so it's been great to meet you and for you to come today. So thank you very much and have a safe journey home.
As you and do feel that you don't have to stay for this, but Ben's just going to play Elgar's Chanson de Nuit to see you on your way.